Hello, and good evening, and welcome to the Good Ancestor, How to Think Long-Term in a Short-Term World with Roman Krznaric, Kate Raworth, and Brian Eno. In a moment, I'm going to hand over to Roman Krznaric, who will be talking us through how we can shift our perspective and behaviours to become good ancestors. We'll then hear from economist Kate Raworth, and then from the Brian Eno, before opening up to questions from us all. There is a chat function on your screen, which I hope you can see, in which you can put your questions and comments, and I hope that you'll feel that gives a chance for you to really be involved in this salon. I'm Helen Bagnall, the founder of Salon London, an organisation designed to get us together with the big ideas, and your host for this evening. I'm so pleased that you've chosen to come together for this salon. It's really lovely to almost see you. Of course, we know the subject tonight is long-term thinking, but I very much hope that you've given a little bit of thought to your short-term and have a cup of tea or maybe a glass of wine in front of you. I do find something refreshing to drink or tasty to eat goes very well with getting to grips with big ideas, and we will be discussing some big ideas tonight. So as you get settled, let me tell you a little bit about how it's going to work and each of our speakers. First, we'll be hearing from Roman Krznaric. He's the author of the brand new book just published yesterday, The Good Ancestor, How to Think Long-Term in a Short-Term World, described by U2's The Edge as the book our children's children will thank us for reading. Exactly, The Edge. And I hope you'll be relieved to hear that you can buy a signed copy of the book from us at any point during the salon, and we'll get it to you. So let me tell you about Roman. He's a leading public philosopher and exceptional communicator of ideas. He's the founder of the world's first empathy museum and is a research fellow at the Long Now Foundation. His work and his writing is dedicated to the exploration of the power of ideas to change society, and he's written a number of successful books to help us do this. Empathy, Why It Matters and How to Get It, The Wonder Box, Curious Histories of How to Live, and Carpe Diem, Regained, all of which have influenced minds, careers and businesses worldwide. Roman's going to be talking to us for about 20-25 minutes. Then we'll hear from Kate Raworth. Kate is known as a renegade economist because her work explores the new economic mindsets we need to address the social and ecological challenges coming at us thick and fast. She's a senior research associate at Oxford University's Environmental Change Institute, and she is also, as many of you will know, the creator of donut economics, which has been wildly influential between sustainable development thinkers, progressive businesses, and political activists alike. Donut Economics, 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist, was a best-selling book. Won our own Transmission Prize in 2017, and its methodology is currently being put into practice in Copenhagen and Amsterdam. Go, Kate. And then we'll be hearing from Brian Eno. Brian, musician, producer, visual artist, activist. You may know him from his time as a founder member of Roxy Music, his production of collaboration with Grace Jones, David Bowie, Talking Heads, among many, or his brilliant light and video experiments and exhibitions from around the world. What you may not know about Brian, he's a founder, a member of the Long Now Foundation. The foundation's name was his idea, having moved to New York City and finding out that now was much quicker in the USA. The Long Now Foundation provides a counterpoint to today's accelerating culture and helps us make long-term thinking more common. And he'll be talking after Kate for about 5 minutes, I understand. But for now, please sit back and hear from Roman Krznaric, exactly how we can be a good ancestor. Roman.
Thanks very much for that lovely introduction, Helen. And hello to everybody. And a special hello, actually, to Kate Raworth and Brian Eno, both of whose work has had a huge influence on my new book, The Good Ancestor. So I'm delighted that they're here. I mean, Kate's work on donor economics has shaped a lot of my economic thinking about systems design. And Brian's famous essay on the big here and the long now has been a constant companion while I've been writing my new book. And this is a book about the long now. It's a book about expanding time horizons. And I want to tell you a little bit about some of its key ideas. And I think the place to start actually is if you can send your mind back to before COVID-19, that far, to the time of the last UK general election at the end of last year. And back then, my partner happens to be Kate Raworth, also on the screen. My partner and I, Kate, we decided to give our 11-year-old twins an unusual birthday present. We decided to give them our votes. So we all sat around the kitchen table, debated the party manifestos, and they told us where to put the X on the ballot sheet. And lo and behold, they didn't exactly follow their parents' political opinions. Now, why did we do this? We did it because we live in an age of pathological short-termism. where we systematically ignore the interest of the generation upon generation of children who will inhabit the future. We know our politicians can barely see past the next election or the latest tweet. Businesses can't see past the next quarterly report. Nations sit around international conference tables focused on their near-term interests while the planet burns and species disappear. And as individuals, of course, we're constantly swiping our phones and clicking that buy now button. This is the age of the tyranny of the now. And there's a kind of paradox in a way, because I feel that this need for more long-term thinking is incredibly urgent. We need it right here, right now. We know we need more long-term thinking to deal with public health issues like the next pandemic on the horizon, to deal with the racial injustice embedded in criminal justice systems and other public institutions and daily life, which is passed on from generation to generation. We need long-term thinking to deal with technological risks coming our way, such as AI-controlled lethal autonomous weapons or the threat of genetically engineered pandemics. And of course, we need that long-term thinking to tackle the ecological crisis, climate change, biodiversity loss, to get us off our short-term addiction to fossil fuels. And if I step back and think about this issue, what I recognize or what I see is that an inconvenient truth, really, which is that we have colonized the future. We see the future as a distant colonial outpost where we can freely dump ecological degradation and technological risk and nuclear waste as if there was nobody there. And it's a bit like the way when Britain colonized Australia in the 18th and 19th century, they drew on a legal doctrine now known as terra nullius, nobody's land, to treat the continent as if there were no indigenous people there. Of course there were. And I think now we also have not just terra nullius, but tempus nullius. The future is seen as nobody's time, a similarly, empty space that is theirs, ours there for the taking. And I think the tragedy of this situation, of course, is that future generations aren't really here to do anything about it. They can't easily throw themselves in front of the king's horse like a suffragette, or go on a salt march to defy their colonial oppressors like Mahatma Gandhi, or block an Alabama bridge like a civil rights protester. They're given no power at the ballot box or in the marketplace. And to really get a sense of this tragedy, let me just show you this image of the scale of unborn generations. There you can see in that little green circle, everyone who is alive today, 7.7 billion of us. If we cast our minds back 50,000 years, an estimated 100 billion people have been born and died there in the gray circle. But go forward 50,000 years, assuming this century's birth rate level off and remain constant, an estimated nearly 7 trillion people will be born. And just look how big that giant orange circle is. There in that orange circle are your descendants, your children and their grandchildren and so on, your nephews and nieces and all their descendants. And I see them in that orange circle looking back on us, asking us, what did we do, or what did we fail to do when we had the chance? And someone who really thought about this a lot was the immunologist Jonas Salk, who in 1955 became famous for developing the first polio vaccine. But later in life, he said that the great question facing our civilization was this: are we being good ancestors? In other words, how are we going to be remembered by those generations to come? And he believed that if we were going to be remembered well, and if we were going to tackle the great problems of our time, like the long-term issues such as the damage to the living world, then we needed to expand our time horizons. Instead of thinking on a scale of seconds and minutes and hours, we needed Brian's longer now, thinking on a scale of decades and centuries and millennia. And in some ways, we've got pretty good at this. There are some really inspiring long-term projects around that we can see around us. Think, for example, of the Svalbard Global Seed Vault in the remote Arctic, which is holding the world's plant biodiversity. Over 1 million seeds from 6,000 species in an indestructible rock bunker designed to last for 1,000 years. Or think of the 10,000-year clock, a project of the Long Now Foundation that Brian's involved in, which is being designed to stay accurate for 10 millennia. It's being built as we speak in the Texas desert. And in a way, that clock is like a secular altarpiece for a long-term thinking civilization to encourage us, inspire us to take responsibility for the generations of the future. Now, at this point, I'd like you to do something for me. I'd like you to just have a look in your little chat function. And I'd like to ask you a question, really, which is this. I'd love you just to jot down 1 or 2 examples of long-term thinking that really inspire you. It could be examples from the arts or from the sciences. I'd love to just see the kind of examples that you've been coming up with, or that you find interesting. It might be something like the Sagrada Familia, cathedral in Barcelona, which was begun in the 1880s and is still being built today. Gaudi worked on it for 43 years. It might be, somebody's just mentioned there, people planting forests. An example that I really like, because I used to be a gardener, and we were planting oak trees and other trees which we would never see mature within our own lifetimes. And most cultures, most religions have come up with different kinds of examples or different ideas encapsulating that idea of planting a tree that you'll never see grow during your lifetime. And of course, we all have those favorite examples that we like of long-term thinking, but there's a really interesting question there of, well, if we are able to plant those oaks which grow after we're born, how does that live alongside our capacity for short-term thinking? How do we actually think long-term? And what we need to do to grasp that is we need to go inside the human mind and recognize that there is a struggle going on in all of our minds between what I think of as the marshmallow brain, there's my marshmallow, and the acorn brain. And here is the struggle between the short and the long. Do we party today or save for our pensions for tomorrow? Do we upgrade to the latest iPhone or plant a seed in the ground for posterity? And the marshmallow brain, of course, is the part of our neural wiring which focuses on immediate rewards and instant gratification. And it's named after the famous marshmallow test from the 1960s, where a marshmallow was placed in front of kids, and if they could resist eating it for 15 minutes, they were rewarded with a second marshmallow. And the result was the majority could not resist, and they snatched it and gobbled it up. But of course, the marshmallow brain is not the whole story of who we are, because we also have this acorn brain, the part which focuses on long-term thinking and planning and strategizing, located in the frontal lobe at the front of the head, particularly in a part called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And this is a new part of the brain, only a couple of millions years old compared to the 80-million-year-old marshmallow brain. And the acorn brain is something that is particularly well developed in human beings. Of course, other animals think forward, they plan, but not like humans. So a chimpanzee might make a plan to take off a branch from a tree, strip off the leaves to make a tool to stick into a termite hole. But they will never make a dozen of these tools and set them aside for next week. But that is precisely what a human being will do, right? We are planners, long-term thinkers extraordinaire. We save for our children's education. We write song lists for our own funerals. It's the acorn brain which has enabled us to build the Great Wall of China and voyage into space. And I can see in the chat there's someone's been talking about colonizing Mars, and maybe we can talk about that as a long-term goal for humankind, whether it is a good one or not, when we come to the Q&A. So we all have this acorn brain, and I think the first stage of becoming a long-term thinker, a good ancestor, is to recognize the story of human nature, a new story, that we are not just short-term marshmallow snatchers, but long-term acorn thinkers. But there's a question then of, how do we switch on this part of our brains? How do we become part-time residents of the future? And in my book, I describe what I think of as a tug of war for time going on in society. You can see in that image there between 6 drivers of short-termism, which are taking us over a cliff edge of potential civilizational breakdown. Things like digital distraction, very familiar, but also the long-term tyranny of the clock, the way that time has been speeding up since the medieval period, where first we measured hours, and then we were measuring minutes on clocks by 1700. By 1800, clocks had second hands, and now we're in the age of the nanosecond. But on the right-hand side, you can see 6 ways to think long-term. There's a chapter on each of those in the book, and I want to just say a few words about just 3 of them: cathedral thinking, legacy mindset, and intergenerational justice. So with cathedral thinking, which is probably the most obvious manifestation of using our acorn brains, that is the idea of embarking on projects with long time horizons lasting decades, centuries, even longer. It's named, of course, in honor of those medieval cathedral builders who began building even though they knew their cathedrals or minsters would not be finished within their own lifetimes. Greta Thunberg, of course, has famously said that we'll need cathedral thinking to tackle the climate crisis. But let's remember that cathedral thinking comes in many different forms. In the image in the top left-hand corner, you can see a classic example, Alminster Lutheran Church in southwest Germany, begun in 1377. The world's longest crowdfunding project funded by local citizens, wasn't finished for more than 500 years until 1890. On the right, you can think of it, see an example, less of cathedral thinking, more of sewer thinking. Those are the sewers of Victorian London, masterminded by Sir Joseph Bazalgette, the engineer, who's got his top hat on along the top on the right-hand side. The sewers were built after the Great Stink of 1858. Bazalgette and his 22,000 workers spent 19 years on it, and they built the sewers twice as big as they needed to be, and that's why they are still being used today. Incredible long-term vision, incredible sewer thinking or cathedral thinking. And in the bottom left-hand corner are the suffragettes, because they're cathedral thinkers too, or they were. So are most social and political movements which are engaged in long-term struggles. The first suffragette organization, founded in Manchester, 1867, did not achieve its main aims of votes for women until more than half a century later. And I think all of those examples I find, and maybe you find, really inspiring. But let's remember that cathedral thinking is not always good for us. It can be directed towards narrow and self-serving goals. Hitler wanted to create an 1,000-year Reich, or the regime in North Korea wants to preserve its power through the generations, passing on power and privilege to their children, generation upon generation. Or think in the corporate world. I mean, the former head of investment bank Goldman Sachs, Gus Levy, once said, "We're greedy, but long-term greedy, not short-term greedy." Well, that's a very narrow form of cathedral thinking. And that's why we need to join cathedral thinking with another approach to long-term thinking, and that is the idea of developing a legacy mindset. And if you stop for a moment and think about legacy, we are the inheritors of extraordinary legacies from the past, from those who planted the first seeds in Mesopotamia 10,000 years ago, who built the cities we still live in, who made the medical discoveries like Jonas Salk that we still benefit from. But also we are the inheritors not just of positive legacies, but of negative legacies from our, one might call our bad ancestors, those who bequeathed us colonial era and slavery era racism and prejudice, which is built into our policing systems and judiciaries and into our cultural life, and it's getting passed on. And so we need to stop and think about, okay, well, what legacies are we going to pass on to the next generation? How do we want them really to remember us? Now, the thing about human beings is we tend to express our legacies in very different ways. 3 ways, I think. The first way is through what I think of as egotistical form of legacy, like a Russian oligarch who wants a wing of the National Gallery named after them. That's how they want to stay alive and, defy their mortality. And a second form of legacy is the idea of familial legacy, passing on things to your children or grandchildren. We all want to do this, whether it's a house or wealth, or passing on culture and tradition, passing on languages or religion. But I think if we're going to be good ancestors, we need to embrace a more transcendent sense of legacy, thinking about leaving a legacy for the universal strangers of the future, the people we will never know and never meet. But how do we make a connection with them? Because they are so distant from our lives, particularly if we live in a hyper-individualistic consumer culture like this one. And in order to make that leap, I'd like to take you on a little bit of a thought experiment, which I call the Great Chain of Life. And I've adapted it from Ella Saltmarsh and others who founded a fantastic project called the Long Time Project. So thanks to them. What I'd like you to do for a moment is just please close your eyes and imagine in your mind's eye a child you know and care about, maybe a godchild or a nephew or niece or one of your own children or grandchildren. Just picture their face for a moment. Now I'd like you to imagine them 30 years in the future. Again, picture what they look like. Think about what brings them joy or what struggles they might be facing. And now, still with your eyes closed, a final imaginative step. Imagine them at their 90th birthday party, and they're surrounded by family and friends and old work colleagues and neighbors, having a great big party, 90th birthday. Go and have a look out the window. What's happening in their world? And then go back over and look at that 90-year-old's face and see someone approaching them with a tiny baby, which is put into their arms. This is their first great-grandchild. And they look down at that baby into its eyes and they think to themselves, what will this child need to survive and thrive into the years and decades ahead? Just sit with that thought for a moment. Now just open your eyes again and consider that that tiny baby could live well into the 22nd century. Their future isn't science fiction. It's an intimate family fact. And it's only a couple of steps away from your own life. And certainly when I do that thought experiment and imagine Kate and my 11-year-old daughter, Siri, when she's 90 years old, you know, it gives me goosebumps. It can be quite terrifying in a way, particularly for those who have a dark vision of the future. But I also see that she is not alone. And that tiny baby, the grandchild, is not alone. They are part of a whole web of relationships, of human relationships, of community, part of the web of life, of the air that they breathe, of the food that they eat. And I think if we're going to care about leaving a legacy for them, for their lives, we have to care about all life. We have to make the leap from the familial to the transcendent. We need to think about the gifts we might leave for the universal stranger of the future. And there's a really wonderful artwork which I think encapsulates this beautifully. It's a 100-year art project from the artist Katie Patterson called Future Library. You may have heard of it. And Future Library started in 2014. And every year for 100 years, a famous writer is depositing a book which will remain hidden in secret until the year 2114, at which point the 100 books will be printed on paper made from 1,000 trees, which have been planted in a forest outside Oslo. Now, the first person to deposit a book was Margaret Atwood, Elif Shafak, many other famous writers have done it. But just think, Margaret Atwood has written a book that she will never see published in her own lifetime. She will never meet any of the readers. It's an extraordinary legacy gift. So I think we can all ask ourselves what gifts we do want to leave for future generations, and think about the golden rule: do unto others as you'd have them do unto you, but in a temporal sense, like an intergenerational golden rule. Let's treat future generations how we would wish past generations to have treated us. And now finally moving from the personal to the more political, really, thinking about intergenerational justice. Groucho Marx famously said, allegedly said, why should I care about future generations? What have they ever done for me? And certainly for me, that makes me think about the absolute vital importance of bringing future generations into our political systems, giving them a voice. I used to be a political scientist, and in the 10 years I was apparently an expert in democratic governance, it never once occurred to me that we systematically disenfranchise future generations in the way that slaves and women have been systematically disenfranchised through history. But I think that is the reality. But there is some good news here. There have been some really extraordinary developments in recent years with designing myopia out of politics. For example, in Finland, there's a parliamentary committee on the future. In Wales, you may know there's a Future Generations Commissioner. There's a campaign in the UK called Today for Tomorrow, which I urge you to support, which is campaigning for the whole UK to have a Future Generations Commissioner as well. In fact, I'm going to be briefing MPs about this next week. But the example of long-term political thinking I really love is something called future design from Japan. And here's a picture of it. It's a citizen assembly model where citizens, random citizens are invited to come to a meeting in their town or city to decide on city planning. And they are split into two groups. Half of them are told they are citizens from the present, and half of them are told that to imagine themselves as citizens from the year 2060. And they're given these almost sort of ceremonial green kimonos to wear, you can see there, to help their imaginative journey. And it turns out, of course, that the residents imagining themselves in 2060 come up with much more radical plans than the current residents when it comes to environmental policy or education, healthcare, transport across the board. And this future design model is spreading through municipalities in Japan. I'd love to see it spreading through local authorities in progressive cities in the UK and elsewhere. In fact, I love to sort of infiltrate it or bring it into a reform of the House of Lords in Britain, get rid of those 92 hereditary peers that are still there and turn the House of Lords into a house of the future, really oriented towards future generations. So there are a few thoughts about how we can become good ancestors. It's just touching on topics. I haven't spoken about deep time and transcendent goals and other things in that tug of war. But this is part of how we decolonize the future. It's a journey, but it's a journey that begins now, because here we are at an extraordinary moment of history, a moment of crisis and opportunity because of COVID-19. You know, the economist Milton Friedman, who I don't quote very often, once said, "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change." And I think that's a pretty good historical rule of thumb. You know, the crisis of the Second World War, out of that came pioneering long-term institutions like the World Health Organization or the European Union or the National Health Service in the UK. And I hope too that at this moment of crisis we're facing now could emerge the pioneering long-term institutions for our challenges of this century, the challenge of the ecological crisis, of racial injustice, of technological risk. And I believe that if we step up to that challenge, if we become wise thinkers and long thinkers, we could well become the good ancestors that future generations deserve. And at that point, I'd like to stop, and I can't wait to hear what Kate and Brian have to say.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Roman. And there's so many examples of long-term thinking coming through in the comment box there. And thank you for putting them. And do please carry on putting your questions and comments. We've got some great ones already into the comments book, so I can put them to Roman, Kate, and Brian later. So I'd like to now hand over to the economist, Kate Raworth. Kate.
Thanks, Helen. This is, of course, an enormous pleasure for me because since Roman and I are partners, I've lived this book for the last 3 years that he's been writing it, but of course, many years before when he first started thinking about these ideas. So these thoughts have been long conversations in our kitchen. And for me, I wrote a book called Donut Economics, which is about meeting the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. What Roman's doing with The Good Ancestor is bringing a much needed fourth dimension that actually gives the time scale and that length of thinking that's essential if we're going to have even half a chance of bringing ourselves into this donut of a thriving planet and people. And I want to share one other diagram. As you can see already, there's amazing pictures in this book, but there's one that I particularly have been influenced by, which Roman calls it the sort of scale of human time horizons, both in public life and in personal life, going from things that happen on the scale of seconds to minutes, hours, days, months, years, decades, centuries. And as you can imagine, we had great fun asking ourselves what kinds of cycles of minutes or days or months fit well illustratively on these scales. And I really like this picture because it helps me see these little cycles, tiny cycles within slightly longer ones, these wheels within wheels within wheels, rotating extremely fast and some turning so slowly we can't notice it. And what this evening has given me the chance to do is to think, okay, how does this kind of long-term thinking and seeing these cycles within cycles really connect with the ideas of donut economics that I'm sharing? And so in the best way, it's made me think of things I've never thought of before, which is what I want to share now. So Roman doesn't even know what I'm going to say. Here's the donut. For anybody who doesn't know it, it's a prosperity in the 21st century. The concept is leave nobody falling short in the hole in the middle, short on the essentials of life that every person has a claim to, like food, energy, healthcare, education, housing, political voice, gender equality. Leave no one falling short in the middle, but don't overshoot these outer rings, these life-supporting systems of planet Earth, don't cause climate breakdown, ocean acidification, don't create a hole in the ozone layer, don't destroy biodiversity. So it's a balance where we meet the needs of all within the means of the planet. Now, this conversation, indeed, this book, has made me suddenly look at the donut through fresh eyes, especially through those scales of time horizons, because I suddenly see so many different time scales at work. And there's something really interesting going on, actually. Inside, let's just jump inside the donut, the space of humanity. So here at the top, energy, water, food, health. These four are really short cycles of daily necessity. I mean, we eat 3 times a day. We drink constantly. If you go without water for 3 days, you die. So this is fast stuff. Energy, most people now live with some form of electricity. So if the power went off within 24 hours, you would really be suffering, as would our food supply chains, our digital connections, our traffic systems, the way our governments run. So we're very tightly tied into energy use. And health, well, COVID-19 has brought our health cycle down to a 14-day self-isolation, or in the worst scenarios for people, it's literally 25 days from catching the virus to death. So all of humanity around the world is now in this very, very tight health cycle. So we live in very, very short circuits here. Now, on the side, we've got networks of transport and communication, housing, education, income, and jobs. I'd say that's decadal cycles of countries building this capacity, this infrastructure. But then down here at the bottom, gender equality, social equity, political voice, peace and justice. These are multi-generational struggles, the very struggles Roman was talking about. This is the suffragettes. This is the civil rights movement. This is decolonization. This is democratization. These don't get achieved in any one person's lifetime. So just within the human space, we've got so many different scales of cycles of transformation and achievement. Of course, there's all sorts of fascinating tensions between them. But then now step out. And here we are with the planetary boundaries, Earth's life-supporting systems. And we've actually gone off the scale of that beautiful chart that Roman drew, because we're way beyond centuries. The carbon cycle of climate change, it's 100,000 years of literally an atom of carbon cycling. But when we release carbon dioxide, it stays in the atmosphere for 300 to 1,000 years. Phosphorus, which is an essential nutrient for fertilizer, it has a 20,000 year cycle to create phosphorus. It's a finite stock and we're running out. Water, 1 drop of water in the ocean can take 3,000 years before it gets evaporated and becomes mist ready to fall as rain in the air. So these cycles are phenomenally long in relation to our own little lives or even our multi-generational struggles. Now, let me tell the other side of this story. On land conversion, you can destroy a forest overnight. You can destroy biodiversity. But nature is so forgiving of us. I asked George Monbiot, who's very well known for his work on rewilding, I said, how long does it take? And he said, well, 5 years, you can already begin to achieve a lot. You can start to release nature's processes. And within decades, a landscape can be transformed. Many people have seen these extraordinary photographs of land that looked hopeless. Let nature back and it just starts to regenerate life. So there's hope in the cycles that nature actually is forgiving of us. And then the ozone layer that we created an enormous hole in around 2000, it began to, that stopped and it began to repair. It's repairing about 1 to 3% a year. So by the 2030s, if we maintain that progress, we could repair that hole. So there's so many different cycles and scales going on. What do we do with that? And I suddenly looked at the donut and thought, what do I do with that? First of all, we've been in a Holocene phase of life for the last 11,000 years in this light, beautiful home sweet home of humanity in Earth's life-supporting systems. And by a really interesting coincidence, Earth system scientists believe that if humanity didn't disturb Earth systems as we are now doing, this phase of Earth's history could last for another 30 to 50,000 years, the very same length of time as that diagram Roman showed with the giant orange bubble of all those unborn billions of people. That is their right to a stable climate and fertile soils and healthy oceans that we must hold for them. What do we do with this? How do we hold it? For me, the only way to hold it is to start to see ourselves as tiny fast cycle members of much, much bigger, slower processes. And I deeply believe in the power of pictures, and that's why I drew this donut. But I also believe in the power of dynamics and visualizing those pictures. So quite honestly, I'm just waiting for Brian Eno to compose a piece of music that helps us hear those tiny cycles within cycles within cycles, at which point I will stop and hand over to him.
Thank you so much, Kate. Brian.
You need to unmute, Brian.
Okay, can you get me now? Well, thank you both for, you can hear me okay, can you? Yeah, all right. Thank you both for some very inspiring comments. I'd like to start by talking a little bit about the Long Now Foundation, which we started in 1996. The idea being that we wanted to put the idea of long-term thinking on the agenda. We were all very aware that there was a huge acceleration going on in human affairs, where people were more and more concerned with not only microseconds, but nanoseconds and picoseconds. And, you know, there was this thing called high velocity trading. You probably know about this, where robot trading of stocks and shares is done in fractions of a second, so short, in fact, that it matters whether your terminal is a few feet closer to the exchange than somebody else's terminal. Those few picoseconds make a difference to your ability to trade. So I think a few of us had got to thinking this was rather crazy, that we were now living in a civilization that paid a huge amount of attention to microseconds and picoseconds, and almost no attention at all to the future, the real future. Stuart Brand came up with a very nice, Stuart Brand was one of the co-founders of this organization called the Long Now Foundation. And he came up with a very nice phrase. He said, we are as gods, and we might as well get good at it. The implication being, here we are, the human race, more powerful than it has ever been, possibly the most powerful creatures that have ever existed in the universe. And in a strange way, also the most irresponsible. In history, if you go back, you can find many, many examples of cultures that habitually thought quite long term, particularly in terms of religious experiences, that thought that building a cathedral was a good idea, even if there was no chance that you would see it in your life, that planting a grove of olives was a good idea because your grandchildren would benefit from them. So this kind of anticipating a future is not an exotic thing for humans to do. They've been doing it for a very long time. In fact, if you think about it, the whole of settled civilization, which is based around cultivation, is a sort of futuristic enterprise. So let's make these fields good. Let's plant seeds. Let's protect the fields, look after the soil, and do rotation farming and so on to make sure that the soil stays good. All of those things are future thinking. And we generally don't value that any longer as a talent. There are very many interesting stories. I don't have long to talk, so I won't go into any of them yet. What I want to ask, what makes it possible for us and makes it easy and desirable for us to think long term? And I think one of the first things I would say is community, the sense of community. Now, a community has built into it a word that I think is very important, which is the word commons. Communities are groups of people who have something in common and who want to maintain that something in common. And in fact, for any community to survive, really, it has to have that common enterprise. One of the examples Roman mentions in his book, which is a very good book, by the way, I really recommend it. is the people who maintain the polders in the Netherlands. So the polders are the parts of land that would be undersea, but the Dutch have built dikes and keep draining them and making sure that they are protected. And in fact, a quarter of the Netherlands is land that was reclaimed from the sea. The consciousness that you need to keep the polders running is, first of all, cooperative. It's a cooperative commons. And I think one of the phrases Roman quotes is somebody saying, you can't, it's something like this, you have to be able to work with your enemy because he might be the person next to you in the polder. So you have to be able to cooperate on long-term projects like that. And a commons is a cooperative process. So how do we make, the question to me is, how do we make the whole planet a commons that we share and that we look after together? Because this is actually the ability to do at the moment. And I think there are a few quite important indicators as to how not to do it. COVID has actually provided us with some very good examples of how not to attack these kinds of problems. It's very interesting to me that the three countries that are doing worse, that's to say America, the UK, and Brazil, are the three countries with macho authoritarian leaders. The countries that are doing best, very many of them have female leaders. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that reflects an understanding of the importance of caring, of looking after the home, the place where we are, where we live. The sort of doctrinaire, dogmatic buffoons like Johnson and Bolsonaro and Trump are people who think that reality will bend to their will, and who also think, in a prime example of that syndrome, that they must be right because they're the leader of the country, so they must be right. It proves that they're correct. We really need to now start thinking about how do we reach agreement about things like this? How do we reach consensus? And I mean, I wrote down a few things that I thought might help. Some of them are in Roman's book. This notion of future representatives of the future. I think that's very important. I think sortition, which is the ancient Greek idea of electing representatives randomly. So instead of choosing people who have a proven track record or went to the right school or the right connections or whatever, you choose randomly a group of people. And I would say, good, let's do that. And let's choose randomly children in those groups as well. This is very important, I think, to harness the intelligence and the hopes of children. In political terms, what about caps on wealth? How can you possibly make a commons work if some people have an investment in it and other people don't? If you're very wealthy, you are insulated from the effects of your own behavior. You can buy yourself out of trouble, to a certain point, of course, until everything collapses. But this is what we see now elites doing. Elites just move up the hill where the floods don't happen, or they just move to the countries where global warming isn't yet a problem. So I think capping wealth, apart from the social justice aspect of it, makes sense in terms of putting us all in the same situation vis-a-vis the importance of the planet and the importance of our arrangements in it. Another thing that I think would be enormously helpful is to get rid of all sorts of offshore tax shelters. I know this seems like a very small thing, but that represents trillions and trillions a year taken out of the budgets of countries. And those are the budgets which would be building our futures. Another one would be, have I gone on for a long time? I have no idea. There's no feedback here, so I don't know whether I'm going on too long. But I'll carry on until you switch me off. Another thing would be campaign contributions limited. You know, I just read yesterday that Sheldon Adelson, the Las Vegas entrepreneur, has put $200 million into Trump's campaign. Does anyone think that that's a good idea? Does anybody think that that could possibly produce a politics that we wanted? Another very good idea, which is happening now in a lot of countries, is called participatory budgeting, where you invite into the budgeting process the people who live with it, with the results. So in some cities now, 50% of the budget, how the city spends its budget, is decided by citizens. They sit in and they have every right to say, to boycott certain budgets and to encourage certain others. So these kinds of things, I think, these are technical devices, really, but they really make a difference to the structure of the future. And I think we have to think about those. There are two things that are going to, this is all I'm going to say now, I'll finish in a minute. There are two things that I think will really make a big difference to how we see things in the future. The first is law. Those things I was talking about just a second ago, they're all sort of legal arrangements. They're arrangements about how the structure of our societies work. But the second thing is vaguer, and that's love. And that's the idea that we won't save the planet unless we fall in love with it. And I think that province is the area that hopefully I'm part of. It's the area of artists, of writers, of dreamers, of people who love, people who want to show you why they love something. And I think it's very difficult, for instance, to watch a David Attenborough program and then walk away and say, well, I'll just carry on eating shite and throwing the rubbish into the gutter. It changes your life. So that's me finished for the moment.
Thank you so much, Brian. And it's been so moving and inspirational to hear from all three of you, and the areas that your work overlaps has been so revelatory, of economics, of philosophy, and of art. Thank you. There's been a lot of questions come through already, and a lot of love and respect for the three of you. All three of you have changed people's lives that are in the comment section through your work. If you're new to Salon London and you want to ask a question, it's really simple. You just register so you can come in, and then you can put your question in this comment section, question or comment. I'm going to ask Brian, Kate, and Roman a couple of questions. Going to get all three of them to respond to them before we go to the questions. So my first question is really for the three of you. I think we'll go to Roman, Kate, and Brian. And it really is, we're in such an unusual time. And it's one where we're really all focused on the immediate issues, almost as they break daily. How possible is it really for us to shift our vision from crisis thinking to this long-term transformation? Roman.
I think that the complexity of a crisis is that it's like a kind of a devil's fork. It can go in multiple directions. So if you think to the Great Depression, well, the crisis of the Great Depression took some countries, like in Scandinavia, towards social democracy. It took other countries like Germany towards fascism. And so let's not romanticize a crisis, and we can see what's going on in this one. We see some rulers wanting to hang on to the emergency powers that they've given themselves, like in Hungary, but at the same time, as alongside that potential of like an authoritarian residue, a long-term authoritarian residue coming out of this crisis, we have amazing possibilities, I think, for democratic renewal, for the kind of things Brian was talking about sortition and some legal changes. I mean, even in the WhatsApp group that emerged in our street during COVID-19, we didn't normally talk to each other very much in our street, but suddenly we were all on this WhatsApp group. We were swapping soda bread recipes, delivering food for people who were vulnerable and couldn't go out. And I think this is grassroots democracy. It's only a couple of steps from those kinds of, community movements, thinking about what Brian was saying about communities and commoning. It's only a few steps from that to things like that Japanese future design model of creating citizens' assembly, of reinventing democracy for the long term, designing out its myopia So in that sense, ultimately what I think is, because crises are devil's forks, this is about choice. It's about our existential choices as a society, where we want to go. We are agents. Where are we going to go? Towards the donut or towards business as usual? Maybe Kate, you can tell us.
So I'm going to talk about cars and bikes. I see this crisis as the opportunity that nobody asked for to bring about the changes we already knew we needed to make. And I've been working with the C40, which is a network of cities worldwide that are committed to take radical action to stop climate change. And I've had the luck to be on a couple of calls with mayors from these cities in their COVID discussions. And I've been really struck by hearing mayors say, look, I had a plan. I thought it was going to take about 10 years to shift away from so many car lanes in our city, just bring a few more cycling lanes. We were going to introduce it very gradually to just test the water, see if people get you. You know what? I suddenly feel totally emboldened and with permission to do this overnight. In fact, we've done it. We've done it. And while the streets were empty, we went out and we just repainted them and said, sorry, cars out. This is now cycles and scooters and people. And the beautiful thing about doing that restructuring of infrastructure, of space, is that those people, those scooters and cyclists and roller skaters and skateboarders, they were already there. They were just waiting for the space to be made available so that they could become visible. And literally overnight, the streets are streaming with 2 wheels, not 4, and people are smiling. And there's just a complete different atmosphere. And of course, it has knock-on effects for all the activity going on around them in the street. So I see that as a metaphor for the possibility of change, from furlough schemes to basic income schemes that have been introduced in some countries, to housing homeless people in hotels, things that people said that would never happen, and suddenly it's just happened. So as Roman says, crisis can go in both ways, and it can be an extraordinary opportunity to do things we already knew we needed. So you have to hold that long vision of where we've come from and why we felt so stuck, and you have to have the long vision of where we want to go, because otherwise, whether you get a U-shaped or a V-shaped recovery, you don't know where the heck you're trying to point to. You need that long vision to pivot. And I've been really struck by the number of governments who suddenly are interested in the donut, whether it's the city of Amsterdam, the city of Copenhagen, the nation of Costa Rica. We're getting interest from all over the world, of cities in the global north and the global south, saying we need a vision. Is there a vision on the table that helps us think about finance and health and social justice and housing and climate change? Yes, there is. And so, yes, people are pivoting towards it.
Oh, Kate, thank you. My cyclist heart is swelling with hearing that. Thank you. Brian, let's go to you.
My feeling is that, as Kate said, we've lived through and are still living through a quite extraordinary experiment. And the tragedy would be if we don't actually reap the results of the experiment. Now, we really have to start supporting independent media. I'm going to make a cry here for, let's stop watching the bloody news on television and start looking at things like Novara Media and all these new groups that have come up that are trying to tell us what is going on. The mainstream media are really looking in the wrong direction most of the time. They're looking at Trump's tweets. That's the big story, or Katy Perry's tweets or somebody's tweets. It isn't, the answer isn't going to be in the tweets. Please, can we get that clear? There is so much going on. The very interesting thing about this book is that it opened my eyes to how many experiments are going on. And they're going on at all sorts of echelons of society. It's not necessarily at the macro governmental level, but it's often at the city level, for example. Suddenly cities seem to be the places where dynamic change is happening, as Kate just said. And because people can do something there, they don't have to have a big referendum about it. They can try it out in a city. I was talking to a friend of mine who works in China a lot recently. And he said, what the Chinese tend to do now, and this is a sort of technique that they've been refining, is when they want to ask a question like, what would it be like to have a carless city? They look around the world and they see everybody who's making experiments in that kind of direction. and then they send out a research team to each of those countries, and they say, can we watch what you're doing? And they come back with, for example, 7 experiments, 7 different ways of doing that. And then they say, we'll try this one in Guangdong province, we'll try this one in Guangzhou, we'll try this one in, and they run the experiments. And then they see which one worked best. And then they say, okay, that's the one we're going to do. Now, this kind of approach, which to me is entirely unideological, that's the important thing. It's not an ideological approach, it's a pragmatic approach. We want to run cities without cars if we can. Who's been doing it? How well have they done? Let's try, see how it works here. What adaptations do we have to make? You know, this is just bloody good sense. It's so many light years away from the idiotic ideological rut that we in the UK and the US is in at the moment. We really have to become much more pragmatists and recognize that we are experimenters. We are running the biggest experiment that humanity has ever run, and we better get good at it, as Stuart said.
I love that quote from Stuart Brand. Roman, I want to tack on to the end of that question because we've had something come through from Robbie and Andrew, and I know that it's covered in your book, and I think it's a good chance to mention it. And this is this idea that we haven't so far mentioned indigenous people, and of course, you know, their way of thinking has never been forgotten by this way of thinking has never been forgotten by many communities around the world. And I know that's covered you go into a lot of detail in your book, so I thought let's talk about that now, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I mean, so much of my book, The Good Ancestor, is built on insights from indigenous thought, from indigenous cosmologies. You know, I mentioned that future design movement in Japan. Well, they are directly inspired by the Native American idea of 7th generation thinking, which you can find amongst Iroquois peoples, Lakota Nation people, making decisions based on the impact 7 generations ahead. And equally, that thought experiment, which I gave about the idea of the great chain of life, I really developed a lot of that out of Maori culture, New Zealand Maori culture, and the concept of whakapapa, which is the Maori word for genealogy or lineage. And it is the idea that we are all in a great chain of life stretching far into the past and long into the future. And it so happens that the light is shining here on this moment. And what we need to do is really shine the light more broadly. But ultimately, I think what we really get from indigenous culture is a recognition of the importance and vitality of interdependence, our interdependence with the living world. Kate introduced me to an incredible designer and thinker, biomimicry thinker, Janine Benyas. And what she says is, if you look at how nature works, look at nature's 3.8 billion years of R&D, what you see that how other species have survived for generation upon generation, bears, beavers, birds, it is by caring for the place that takes care of their offspring. That's how they survive 10,000 generations from now, by not fouling the nest, by living within the boundaries of their ecosystems. Okay. Now and really there's something fundamental there, which is to be a long-term thinker is to care about place as much as time. And of course, this is what is written into so many indigenous cultures. The indigenous Australian idea, where I'm from Australia, the idea of, you know, being part of the land, being born in the land, and connected to the dream time. And there's a beautiful Mohawk blessing which is given or said when a child is born. It's this: thank you, Earth, you know the way. And I think in that blessing lies an indigenous wisdom that we must carry with us wherever we are, whether we're clicking that buy now button, sitting in a church, or visiting a 1,000-year-old yew tree.
Thank you, Roman. And if you want to read more about that, Roman's book is available. You can buy it on the site right now. Okay, next question is for the three of you, and this is okay. So say we're convinced we want to be good ancestors. So where do we start? And this is quite similar to a question that's coming from Rachel as well. This is this idea of, where should we direct our efforts? Should they be at the economic, the political, or the cultural? What should our priorities be? And Rachel's adding in there as well, what can activists do to bring greater momentum right now? Kate, should we start with you? Kate, Roman, Brian.
Sure. Sometimes I just think that the choice of what to do, I'm just going to say at one level, it's a very personal choice. Some people are extroverts and some people want to bring down the system. Fantastic. Go and lock on. Go and lock onto an oil rig. Go and glue yourself to the doors of a bank. We need that. Wow, the world needs that. Other people are never going to do that. They're much more internal. They're not going to impact on the world in that way. Work from the inside or write beautiful poetry, engage in craftivism. We need that too. We need people who are within the system and say, actually, I work for one of these companies or one of these governments. Great. Now, how are you going to act differently in the next meeting that you're part of? So there's no one way. We need people in all of these spaces, envisioning the new, bringing down the old, slowly transforming that system from the inside till it doesn't recognize how it's been transformed. And I'd say there's just so much we can all do literally within our own homes. So just move your money out of a bank that doesn't give a damn to a bank that's actually set up with a purpose. I personally have moved my money to Triodos Bank as soon as it opened in the UK, because that's what they set up to do, to invest in social and ecological return. Thank you. I'd like my money to be invested and saved there. Move your electricity account. Get out of whatever electricity account you just got first or inherited. Get into a renewable electricity company. There's several in this country. There's no reason to be buying electricity from a fossil fuel company anymore. Change your diet. We all know this, right? Eat far less meat. Ideally, eat almost no meat. Live off plants. Travel differently. Make two wheels your first choice. The Dutch say there is no such thing as bad weather. There's just bad clothing. So get yourself a good rain jacket. Think of holidays differently. Just realize that flights are a last century luxury. They don't make sense unless they are a profound necessity. And then also with your phone, we shouldn't be changing our phones and our gadgets more than, say, once every 7 or 8 years. So that means next time you buy one, buy really smartly. Buy one that can be repaired and restored and upgraded and that's going to last you. So think long in all of these ways.
Thank you, Kate. Roman?
For me, certainly the journey into the world of long-term thinking has taken me on a journey of what it means to be an agent of change. A lot of my books have been about personal change as well as collective change. But what I've seen here, these matters are so urgent that I agree with Kate about doing all those things, but we also need to think about the things that we can do collectively, whether we're an introvert or extrovert. Just to go into your business where you work or the church or community center where you're engaged and ask yourself, how could we be good ancestors? What would it take? Or to have 100-year a plan? Is it about putting solar panels on the roof? Is it about growing a vegetable garden? And do things that can be amplified. For example, when there's great evidence showing that if you stop flying, people who know someone who's stopped flying because of climate change, 50% of them fly less as a result. So there are these contagion effects. But as well as the collective, I do think there is a place for sort of the individual and a place for wonder in a way. There's a wonderful quote about deep time from the great writer John McPhee. He says, imagine the age of the earth as the old measure of the English yard, the distance from the king's nose to the tip of his outstretched hand. One stroke of a nail file on his middle finger erases human history. And I think if you can grasp something of that, that humankind, we have been destroyers in just a couple of centuries of billions of years of life going into the past and into the future. But getting in touch with deep time is difficult. Kate and I take our kids to Lyme Regis every year on the South Coast. We go fossil hunting. And to hold a 195-million-year-old belemnite in your hand or ammonite is to touch a longer now. And I think we need those kinds of experiences, as well as locking ourselves on, as well as shopping differently and jumping on the bike with exactly the right clothing, if we're going to have a full throttle, multi-dimensional approach to becoming good ancestors.
there. Brian, you're a bit in the shadows, but have you got a third approach for us?
Yes.
I think we might.
Um,
Apologies. Brian, are you back?
let me get.
Brian, if you can hear me, I think I'm going to go to another question and then come back to you. I think if we can try and sort out your sound. I have a question.
Well, I can't. I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're back.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes. Please. Are you okay to speak, Brian? I think Brian's got a few issues there. Let's go on to another question and we can always come back. So this is a question from the fellow author, actually, Jules Evans. And he says, some of the leading long now thinkers of the 20th century, H.J. Wells, Jonas Salk, who you mentioned, Aldous Huxley, were both environmentalists, but also eugenicists.
Okay. All right. So...
Brian, we're really struggling to hear you, so I've gone on to another question, so if we can just try and sort your sound on and then I will come back to you. I hope that's okay. So yes, Roman was just saying that so some of the greatest thinkers were both environmentalists but also eugenicists who believed in intervening in the genetic development of humanity to steer our evolution. They suggested individual rights were less important than the future of humanity. Obviously, their methods were unsavory, but what do you think about the long-term evolution of humans and the ethics of trying to manage that?
That is a very complex and interesting question. Of course, long-term thinkers come in many stripes and from many perspectives. In the same way that, I was mentioning, people like Gus Levy from Goldman Sachs, a long-term thinker, but focused on making money, big profits, growth of Goldman Sachs. I guess there are always other people who have approaches to long-term thinking which are very narrow from their specific place. So like eugenics is one, or think of Edmund Burke. He's someone who's the great philosopher from the 18th century, great for conservative thinkers because he wanted to preserve monarchies and aristocratic power. And that's why he opposed the French Revolution, but he kept on, people often quote him as a long-term thinker. So I think that across the spectrum, there's challenging ideas. I guess ultimately, we choose where we find our inspiration from. I choose to look at people like Jonas Salk, I think, going back to Jules's really interesting question. He believed in the idea of metabiological evolution or cultural evolution. This is partly where the geneticists, the eugenicists come from, but not Jonas Salk himself, but others, yes. But he believed that culture could change. We could evolve from what Jonas Salk called Epoch A to Epoch B. He was a great fan of S-curves. As someone I saw mentioning S-curves in the chat, he believed that human society, an industrial society, developed on an upswinging S-curve where we were creating huge wastes, population growth, and so on. But now we're at the top of the curve, what he called moving from Epoch A to Epoch B. And we have to recognize that economic growth doesn't grow forever. As Kate sort of written about, there are limits, planetary boundaries over which we cannot go without throwing the Earth into an unstable system. And Salk believed that to make that shift from A to B, we needed new values. We needed to shift from the individual to the collective, to the person alone to the interdependent, from growing incessantly in consumerism to thriving and striving to thrive in balance. And he also said we need to move from the short range to the long range. And I think we need that cultural shift for a high speed, let's say, cultural evolution so that we can meet the needs of all within the means of the planet so we can get into the donut.
Brilliant answer, Roman. Thank you. And thank you, Jules. Kate, did you want to add to that, or should I go back to Brian?
Yeah, no, let's go to Brian.
Brian, did you want to pick up on, we were just about to hear from you about what our efforts should be in which spheres, the economic, political or cultural, and what should be our priorities. Sorry, we didn't catch any of your answer. I'm sorry.
You're on mute, Brian.
Oh, Brian, you're on mute.
Okay,
Hooray!
sorry.
Perfect.
Yeah. I'd like to talk about education a little bit, because we've slipped into a sort of educational métier now, which I think is very anti-long now, and it's called the STEM subjects. Now, I love science as much as anybody else, and I'm very happy that we're teaching our children science, technology, engineering, mathematics. What I'm not happy about is that we're telling them that those are the important things, and that the rest of it, the humanities, the arts, literature, so on and so on, is kind of gravy, you know, the bit you get if you're good, the dessert, if you like. I would like to say that those things are actually how we determine what is valuable in our lives. The issue of value will not be determined by science. Science discovers things, and it's great, wonderful, we love it. But it's the other side of us, the art side, that digests things. Science discovers and art digests, in my opinion. And what that means is that art allows us to experience the feelings that we have about those things. And it says what do you think of those feelings? You know, for instance,
Brian, sorry, we're gonna have to stop you there. We're gonna have to understand the process of art and education a little bit later. We can get a more stable connection from you. This is, I think, perhaps one for Roman, and I think Klaus has encapsulated this question absolutely brilliant. It's massive, and they have just said, can we
trivial example to experience some of the output. Okay, this is the Industrial Revolution, people. This is the world that you can't.
The question is from Klaus, and they really encapsulate the whole big area of this. Is, can we train our long-term brain?
Okay, so yes, can we train our long-term brain? Well, in a way, that's what my whole book is about. It goes back to this, you know, the idea of the marshmallow and the acorn. But if we're thinking about training the brain, I actually think we need to start a level before that. It's about recognizing a different narrative about human nature. In the same way, if you look in Kate's book on donor economics, you know, there's a chapter about nurturing human nature, and that's about trying to shift from the me to the we, to recognize that we're not just individualistic, self-interested creatures, but we are also collective, empathic creatures as well. We are the most social of mammals. You know, Rutger Bregman has just come up with a recent book, you know, exploring this as well. And in the same way that we need to recognize that we are both me and we have to recognize we're both short and long. We are both the marshmallow and the acorn. So in terms of training our brains, first we need the new story about humankind, right? And that is a very deep thing to inculcate, because all of our institutions are based on an assumption, or most of them are based on an assumption that we are short-term thinkers. Just think of that buy now button. You know, I would love it if, you know, someone to hack into Amazon or other places and change that buy now button. So when you press buy now, actually a drop-down menu comes down and it says buy now, buy in a week, buy in a year, borrow from a friend. You know, and then if after you've pressed buy in a year, then you'll get a reminder in 12 months time. Now, that is how we retrain our brains, actually, by changing our habits. But we need to build those technologies and new political, economic institutions on a recognition that we have the capacity to do this acorn brain thinking, okay? It comes out of a new cultural understanding of humankind. You know, change comes out of changing the ideas of who we are and what we're capable of. That's how we retrain ourselves.
And Kate, do you agree with that?
Yeah, and actually I love the idea of the changing the buy now button. I actually reckon all you'd need to do is add a button that said something like ask me again in 3 days, and consumer spending would probably halve.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we'll go for one more question. I'll bring Brian in at the bottom of this question. This is one for Roman. And this is for Ben, who said, love the idea that all of you've presented for positive change. But Roman, Ben's question is, how do you reconcile the message from your last book, which is Carpe Diem? Carpe Diem, Ben says, and seizing the day with being a good ancestor in your new book. What is your advice for achieving both of these important messages? Kick us off, Roman.
So on the surface, there seems to be a contradiction between someone who writes a book about seizing the day, carpeing the diem, and someone who's trying to think 1,000, 10,000 years into the future. How are those reconcilable? Well, they are. And one of the chapters in my book, Carpe Diem Regained, talks about the idea of collectively seizing the day, carpamos diem. Let's seize the day together. And throughout history, that is what great movements have done. They've brought down the Berlin Wall. They've launched into the Spanish Civil War. And these are all long-term projects, often with long-term effects, in the same way that you can seize the day and decide to get married, and then it has repercussions for your life for years and decades. You decide to have children, you seize that moment, and you're having to think long-term. So to be a good ancestor can be a radical act of this moment. Okay, so let's go and be like Extinction Rebellion and occupy a street. Let's plant oak trees in Parliament Square and protect them while they grow slowly. You know, that is a Carpe Diem act as well. So I see there's no contradiction there. Ultimately, is it all about engaging in a sense of agency in order to be a good ancestor, to think beyond your own ego and beyond your own mortality.
Fantastic. Thanks, Roman. Kate?
Yeah, well, that just really chimes with what I witnessed when I was listening to mayors talking about how they are responding to COVID. And the mayors who said, quick, run out while the streets are empty, repaint the cycle lanes. That is seizing the day, as Roman said, for very transformative long-term patterns that you put in place. You know, Naomi Klein's brilliant book, The Shock Doctrine, said, it's during great disruptions that transformations happen. Transformation doesn't happen in quiet, steady times. So make sure the transformations are the ones that we know we need to bring about, rather than a re-embedding, as Naomi Klein brilliantly documented, re-embedding vested interests. Use this moment to turn it, because if we don't turn it towards the future we want, other interests will be using it to drag back. We've seen leaked letters from fossil fuel interests in Canada writing to the Prime Minister, you know, embedding their interests. That is what has to be stopped. It has to be turned to this new future. So seize the day, absolutely, with that future we need to bring about.
Especially at this moment.
Absolutely.
Brian? No. Let's try. Brian, can we hear? No, we can't. We can't hear from you. Sorry.
It's on mute.
I think we've still got problems with the connections, right? Yeah, okay.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Intermittently, Brian. Intermittently. I'll go to another question.
I'm sorry about this.
Don't worry, I'll go to another question and then come back to you at the bottom of that one. No problem at all. I had a question from Rebecca, and it really reminded me of the fact that, Roman, you're going into Parliament next week, aren't you, to talk about some of the issues in your book to government. And her question is, she says, trust in each other and in the planet itself is going to be key. How can we build and ensure we maintain and make more space for trust?
Really fascinating topic, and I think it very much connects again with what Brian was saying in his initial intervention about community, because ultimately I believe that we will have no long-term future unless we feel a sense of interdependence, unless we feel that we must rely on others. And that, of course, is partly what COVID-19 has done for us. We relied on others to bring us food, and things like that. And out of those experiences, often of crisis, comes shifts in the structure of trust of a society. Now, but how do I communicate that when I talk to members of parliament next week is going to be very difficult, of course, because they are in an institution which is a dog eat dog, stick a knife in someone's back institution. It's not designed to foster trust. And that's why I'm such a big believer in the citizen assembly model. And when Brian was talking about sortition, going back to the ancient Greeks, because we need these sort of participatory forums in order to, A, develop community and trust. But the thing about deliberative assemblies and citizen assemblies is that they are really, the evidence suggests that they are much better at engaging with the long term than politicians who are just caught in the here and now. So when I go to speak to MPs next week, I'm going to have to say to them, I'm sorry, we're going to have to be taking away some of your powers. If we're really going to be wanting to think for the long term, we're going to have to put them back in the hands of citizens, putting trust to work for the long term.
And again, Kate, this really dovetails with your local cities and talking to the mayors.
It does. And actually, this thing of, okay, but what do you say to politicians? I mean, when I wrote Donut Economics, I very intentionally just put aside any attempt to appeal to politicians, because I thought if I write a book that's really kind of practical and pragmatic and doable and implementable, it would just be boring as hell. So I literally thought, I'm not even going to try and be relevant to politics because that'll kill this. I want to think long 21st century. And what's just amazed me over the last 3 years is the number of politicians from across political spectrums, from across the world, and the number of civil servants who are working for them who have come. We've never approached a single one. They keep coming because they are so hungry for a new vision. They are so desperate for a language that means they don't always have to talk about smart, resilient, clean, sustainable, balanced, good growth, but they know they're clearly trying to say something else. So when I talk to politicians, I just don't even try and be sensible and pragmatic and appeal. I talk to them either as individuals or I just go really big, because they deserve that, because almost nobody ever talks to them like that, because they think they need to be just tweakable, just let's get this little measure through. And many, many people are employed in jobs that have to do that little lobby, just get this thing passed. And I think the position that we have the utter privilege to be in this kind of work, myself and Roman and Brian and many others, is to speak to a much bigger vision. And I think you can touch and access something very different. And it's probably the one thing they'll go home and think about quietly that night. So that's my advice, Roman.
There you go, Roman. Advice to you there. Brian, I'm hoping we might be able to get some advice from you.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Oh, what a breakthrough.
Hooray.
Well, perhaps I would, that was really nice what you just said, Kate. It was very inspiring, and I feel quite moved to get up and start talking to people immediately. But I will talk on this for a moment. What I think we have to do as human beings is slightly change our sense of what we're good at. We know we're very good at controlling things. We're good at controlling nature. That's what technology is about. It's about making the world, refashioning the world so that it works for us and for our interests. What we've forgotten that we're also good at is surrendering. Now, what people talk about as the wisdom of indigenous peoples is often world and to be accommodated by it, not to take control of it, but to somehow, that talent tends to get forgotten in technological cultures. We think there's always a technical solution.
Oh, Brian, it was going. it was going.
Of course, is bedeviling us now with climate change. So we now have the problem that people don't want to deal with climate change because they're waiting for technology to come up with some. I can't hear anything from.
I'm really sorry, Brian. It's intermittent, the worst of all technical problems. I've got.
Yes, just leave me out of it. I'll just listen from now on.
Get typing in the comment box, Brian.
Okay.
We've got a quick question, and quite a sad question. I'm going to ask a couple more questions, and then we will close. But a question from the USA, saying that the feeling over there is really the things feel that they're broken beyond repair, and the despair is overwhelming. What advice do you have for our friends over the pond, Roman?
That is such a difficult question.
I know. I can kind of understand why. And your book is...
I mean, I think a couple of things come to mind. One I've already touched on a bit, which is to draw on the power of indigenous thought, particularly the idea, for example, of the seventh generation decision making. That comes out of that continent. I mean, the Nobel Prize winning economist Elinor Ostrom said, we should be making decisions based on the Native American seventh generation principle. The second area of hope in the US, I find, is in the Black Lives Matter movement. Think of a book like, well, in fact, by a Black British woman, Layla Saad, called Me and White Supremacy, but which speaks to Black Lives Matter, which on the first page talks about being a good ancestor. And there's a really important point to make here, which is thinking long term is not a prerogative of just the rich or the socio-economically well off. Often it's those who are most well off have the narrowest view of the long term, like an aristocrat who just wants to hand on their manor house down the bloodline. But in fact, it's often those who are on the margins, who are powerless, oppressed, who strive hardest to think long term. Think of Maori culture in New Zealand, think of Native American culture, and now think of the Black Lives Matter movement, which is struggling against centuries of injustice and trying to do something better for the next generation. I think there is enormous hope in that as well. So I think there are many different United States that one can look at. I'd probably rather be going towards the Lakota Nation people or to people marching on the streets against police violence than to sitting outside the White House and hoping for the long now to emerge from there.
Thank you, Roman. And Kate?
Well, sometimes something old has to give way. If the birth of the new is going to happen, what is it we have to let go of? And the last thing we want to do is let go of systems that actually destroy individuals' lives. And that is the great tragedy of many of these institutions failing. But they have been failing many parts of the US community for many generations. That's what the whole civil rights and Black Lives Matter movement is about. So the idea that it was ever working doesn't hold. Some people talk about the old nation state and the systems of the 20th century declining, becoming compost for a new system. And that's a beautiful metaphor of life, again, regenerating. Nature allows things to break down and rebuilds from those. So what is it? What are the values and skills, the commons and the concept that we want to rebuild a future from? And the seeds of the future are already with us. We too easily see what is letting go and collapsing and breaking down. But just as I said, when you just draw new lines on the street, suddenly that new future is visible. And there are new possibilities emerging from within. In fact, it's the old hanging on that often gets in their way. I'm going to stop because I know that Brian's managed to turn off his screen, so I'm hoping we might get his voice one more time.
Brian, can we have a word from you?
You'll have to unmute, mate.
I think he may have totally disappeared, actually.
He's disappeared into the shadows.
I don't think so. He's in it for the long run, this one. He's not gone.
Brian, are you there? Are you there, Brian? Yes. Brian, we're coming to the close. Do you have any last words for us?
Oh, God. This is such a painful way to have a conversation.
I'm so sorry.
Can you hear me?
It's lovely to see you. Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. So, oh dear. Well, I am slightly jangled by this trying to get the phone to work. But I suppose what I want to say is that we have to stop. We have to get off the canary cage thing, the hamster cage thing of capitalism, and doing the obedient things. I wrote this song ages ago, which I never released, called The Obedient Shopper, because I thought
it really is an incredibly interesting audio experience we're having with you, Brian, but it wasn't quite the one we were expecting. We
had all become, actually. That was all we had become. The only point of our existence now was to be good shopper. You can't hear me, aren't you?
No. We're going to go to one final question to Roman. I'm sorry, Brian. And that is, tonight has been...
I'll just sign off because it's too
this tonight has really been about your incredible book, Roman. Years in the writing. We all want to come around to your house and be friends with you and Kate, and it must be fascinating. It's a brilliant book. It's got such incredible ideas. You're going into government next week. What are your wildest dreams for this book? Tell us.
Sorry, my first dream for this book was to actually have this conversation with Kate and Brian, because I had so many questions for them. I wanted to ask them about the connections between regenerative economics and generative music. I had all these questions for Brian about Terry Riley's In C, that 1964 piece, which inspired him, and that I've been listening to as I've been writing this book. And I'm so sorry to everybody, including my cousin Raphael May. I can see there writing comments in the chat box from Australia, from Sydney. It must be 4 or 5 in the morning. And I'm so sorry he hasn't got to hear, because he actually came not to hear me, but to hear you, Brian, because he's a composer for film. So I'm sorry about that, everybody. So what's my greatest hope for the book? Look, as Kate says, we are all just part of a great flotilla. On my website, I've listed over 45 organizations committed to long-term thinking, from the Long Now Foundation to the UK's All-Party Parliamentary Group for Future Generations, to the people who produced the film 2040. There's all sorts of amazing things going on. There is a grand time rebellion in process now. This is an extraordinary moment of history. We are reinventing our economies and our democracies. Adam Smith did not even realize in the Industrial Revolution that there was an Industrial Revolution going on. He couldn't see it. I believe we may well be in one of those moments of transformation now. I just hope that the book I've written can be part of opening our eyes a little bit wider, giving us a bit of a sense of wonder, and galvanizing us to see into a longer future.
Thank you so much, Roman. I think, as your editor said last night, a good book makes you think, a great book changes how you think. And, you have written that. As you say yourself, the path of the good ancestor is in front of us. It's our choice whether we take it or not. And as Brian said, quoting Stuart Brand, we are as gods, we might as well get good at it. We might as well get good at it. It's been a wonderful salon to celebrate a good ancestor. It's been fantastic to hear from you, Roman, from you, Kate, and from you, Brian, and also an additional ambient vocals from you as well at some point, which is entirely unexpected. It's been an extraordinary salon. I hope we get to do it. I hope we get to do it in real life. So I just wanted to say thank you so much to Roman, to Kate, and to Brian. And I want to say thank you so much for joining us on this Thursday evening. I'm sorry that we had some technical issues, but I can see from all of the comments and all of your thoughts that it really has stimulated some incredible thoughts and ideas and amazing comments and questions. Thank you so much for all of them. As I mentioned before, Roman's book is available to buy from us. We will get a signed copy to you. It's slow buying. You buy it from us. We actually have to put it in an envelope, write it, and then post it. So it really is buy now, get in a week or so. So it's very much not the buy now culture. Thank you so much for coming. I hope we see you again. Salon. This salon is now closed. Thank you.